Okay, Grant, welcome to the show. Mate, do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about your background? And I'm really interested in the fact that you became the managing partner of your firm, MPH Lawyers, at a really young age. Do you want to just take us back there and the early days?
That's back to the 90s. So I was quite lucky, I suppose, because I came out of university. I worked full-time when I was at university and I studied full-time, which really means, I crammed in my study on the back end of things. So when I was going out into the workforce, I was already looking at the people I wanted to work for, I suppose, from a business perspective. And being a lawyer, I think there's a way of doing things, particularly in those days, where you sort of get canvassed as an article clerk. And bear in mind, article clerks in those days were paid something like $20,000, $25,000. It was, and you're expected to wash cars and do the partners,
do everything.
dirty work and everything. And I interviewed with a bunch of different firms, and I was lucky. And I met with some national firms because we didn't really have international firms in those days. And then I met with one gentleman, my partner Didier, who at the time had his own little practice. He'd left a bigger firm, started out with a senior associate, and I just got on with him. And I just thought, this is actually who I want to do business with, which kind of has guided me, I suppose, ever since. And I was lucky in that Didier, I suppose, recognized in me someone who was fairly open to ideas because he was a commercial lawyer and had a commercial practice, and which I liked because it was business related. And he wasn't trying to say, you will do this or you will do that. He just talked about the type of his clients. And so to cut things short, really what happened is that we started working together. So I started off as a litigator. This is from 97 onwards. And then around about 2000, I started running the whole firm. And then we started building it out so that we became a business services firm, basically, doing corporate, commercial and litigation. And the sort of philosophy has really never changed, in that whether you're working for a small business, a family office, a medium-sized, mid-sized companies, which tend to be our sort of space, you're still going, the first question I usually ask is, what are you actually trying to achieve with what we're doing? How do we get you out of this problem? Sometimes your back's against the wall, or sometimes you're recovering, money. But once you've done that, I started looking on the other side of it. Why did you get into this in the first place? And how do we fix that and move around it? And then what's the bigger intention behind it? And so then I really became an advisor and negotiator for different businesses. So that was how I got there. And then really I've been doing that for 25 years now.
And in terms of the business as it grew, what was the biggest difference? Lawyers have certain attributes typically, and entrepreneurs and business builders have different skill sets often. What was the biggest difference that you had to bring to the table to go from being sort of thinking as a lawyer or thinking as a business owner and looking at growth, or were there crossovers?
I think there are crossovers. Look, it helps to be curious. It helps to be interested in your client's business. That's the first thing. If you're a service provider, which lawyers are, and again, if you become an advisor of any sort, I think this is critical. It's not looking at it from a transactional based style thing. It's really saying, be understanding your client's business properly. And a lot of people don't take the time to do that. They look at, what is the job that I'm tasked to do? And what you're tasked to do sometimes is not necessarily what you're needed for, and which I think is critical. And then that's one of the things, quite often you're asked your advice on certain things, and you can give that advice, but also what you've got to be able to do is tell people what they need, not necessarily what they want. And sometimes those two things coincide and sometimes they don't. And so then how do you deliver that message? And so I think the delivery of that message is critical. And really this is what sets a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs apart, is how they communicate with the different relationships with their staff, with their clients, and with their business partners. And so if you don't have those skills, I think it's very hard to grow a business unless you bring people around you who have those skills. And that key communication. So how do you communicate the idea of what your objectives are, what your culture is, or what your advice is a very important skill to have. And so it's something that everyone can work on. I mean, I continue to work on it because sometimes it's also not about what the message is. It's as I've learned, particularly as I've gotten older, it's about the messenger and who's telling them to do something and who can relay a message and who people will listen to. Being an advisor of any sort is the same thing. You're dealing with huge amounts of data coming in and you're having to process it really quickly and articulate it in as simple a fashion as possible. And so, again, that's one of the things that, you've got to get good at is making complicated ideas simple.
Yeah.
And again,
that's so important, right? That's a lot of what is missing out there because people tend to talk in jargon and make things. I mean, the investment industry is fantastic at it. They'll talk in jargon. They make everything sound so complex so they can continue to charge the fees they charge versus making complex things simple so that the client can actually execute and deal with it. You don't have to necessarily talk in jargon when you're talking to the client. So I think that comes down to the communication side too, right?
Well, you don't. And all the best communicators that I know are actually quite simple communicators. And I actually have a bit of a rule of thumb because I have people present at various levels. Sometimes you're going into companies to look at what's going wrong. Sometimes you're fixing a problem. Sometimes you're trying to work out, when someone's telling you something, are they telling you everything? The more people talk in a way that you can't understand, and I'm quite happy to say I don't understand that and then ask questions. And if they can't convey it to you in a way that you understand, generally, you're either saying, in rare cases, there are people who are just very bad communicators, but a lot of the time it's because they're either, let's be honest, full of shit, or they don't know what they're talking about. And that's quite often, I've actually seen this before where people who manage upwards as opposed to managing downwards and don't really know their job, but just keep everybody happy. And I sit on a bunch of different boards. People who manage upwards often don't know their job. And when you actually start quizzing them in a very simple way, and that can be as simple as, what do you do?
Good place to start.
It's a really good place to start. And it's actually one of the things you do when you go into companies and looking at, how they're structured and how the reporting lines and so on work. So I think that's a key thing, is that those people who are simple messages are actually the ones who drive forward. And let's face it, with business generally, simple messages are the ones that resonate with people because people remember them, for one, because simple messaging is easier to remember, but also attention spans, I think, have got shorter over the years. And so if you can't communicate simply, you're just not going to get people's attention, even though it might be a really great thing that you're wanting to impart, whether it's at a startup level or what your business idea is. If you can't grab their attention and hold it, and there's those old rules about if you're public speaking, for example, you gain everyone's attention. They remember the first sort of minute, and then they remember the last couple of minutes. Most of what's in between, they don't generally. And so you've got to capture that idea and whatever you're trying to impart straight off the bat.
Yeah. You were talking earlier about mentors and people along that way. Have you got a couple of people that really stood out as people who guided you or gave you great advice along the way, and especially in the early days, but any time really?
Yeah. So, my partner Didier, who's one of we've got 7 other partners in our firm, but he was the guy who started the firm, Didier Mercier, and he was great because he had a very good financial background, as well as he had a commerce background, as well as a legal background, and it started the firm. And I could always go to him and say, I'm thinking of doing this, what do you think? And then we'd just have a very open and frank discussion about stuff. And I think that's also important, is having someone you can trust enough to say, I might be doing something stupid here, but so I need to know whether it's a good idea or not a good idea. And don't be afraid to be told you're an idiot, or just get critical feedback on it. And I think there's a big difference between thinking about criticism and critical feedback, because a lot of people take it as criticism, but that's kind of how you learn, is that's not a good idea because of this and so on. And sort of learning those nuances and having nuanced conversations with mentors is the biggest thing you learn, because there's no black or white to a lot of things. And so how you approach clients, how they might think about things, how perspective is an interesting one. One of the things I think I learned very early from him is thinking about how your client is looking at what you're talking to them, what position are they in, because they're paying you a lot of money. And I wouldn't want to have to pay, me. And that's, if you look at it from that point of view, if I was having to pay me on a daily rate, then what am I getting for that? And also, it was interesting when I was doing, a lot of litigation. The thing about litigation is that you're always, your client, as a client, you're always stressed. So you're then dealing from a position where you're having to pay money and you're stressed. So they've got a unique perspective. And then that was sort of one lesson I think I learned on, really early on in terms of those solutions. Goes back to what are they trying to achieve? What do they really want out of this, rather than and giving objectivity to it. And I'm lucky in that's for one of my skill sets is being able to look on top of things fairly easily and be objective about it. I probably wouldn't have lasted long. I do a lot of M&A work and litigation work still. And again, working with startups and innovation, it's all the same. You've got to be able to look on top and see the whole picture, and then work out how you execute the different parts. And so I got that. I had that innately, I suppose, but it was something that was fostered in me by people like Didier. And then I had various clients who were a lot older than me when I was advising them. So I had clients who were sort of, when I was sort of 25 to 30, were sort of in their 50s to sort of mid to late 60s, and had built up sort of some fairly decent sized businesses. But what I learned is that, well, they were coming to me for advice. So, and that's where you realize that there's a reason that they know a lot of stuff that you don't know, but they're coming to you for a reason no different to how we go to a doctor for advice on something. And by the same token, then, you can gain a lot from them in terms of how they view the world. One of my great friends, and who was a client of mine back in the day, was a guy, Jeff Lewis, who started a company called ASG. And I became a lawyer to that. I met him, we met at a wedding of all things, and just started chatting about business as you do. And so I ended up advising the company for a number of years, went onto the board, and that was an IT managed services business. And it was the first business into the cloud back in 2013 or so, when the cloud wasn't really a popular word.
People still working out what it was.
Yeah, everyone was working out what it was. And, went on to the board of that. We sold that business for $350 million to Nomura, securities from Japan. But Jeff was a really good guy, and still is with me. And we, this is someone I catch up with on a weekly basis. And we've got another company, we do working at the moment. But always getting perspective on the corporate world and how it functions at a public company level.
Yep. Which
was interesting to me because private and public operate quite differently.
Yeah, completely different beast, right?
It is a different beast, and the narrative's so important at a public company level. And I don't think when I started I had appreciated just how much narrative is critical to people supporting the business as opposed to the business fundamentals.
Yeah. Narrative in what way? What parts of the narrative, Grant, are you talking about?
I think the narrative in terms of this is where we're going to, and this is how we're going to do it. You've got to keep articulating to the public and to the brokers and so on who support you, and the institutional investors who support you. At a private level, you have to do that, but generally people who are prepared to invest in private businesses are a lot more patient. I mean, there'll be some who just go in and think, throw some money in because they're interested to see where it goes. But generally the people who are going to do the bigger licks, as long as you're informing the roadmap, you don't have to give them sugar hits every, so often to tell them the pathway. You just have to execute on the business. And as long as you're executing and they can see the numbers, then you're fine. And then the thing I think I've learned from the various people who've mentored me over time is that business intelligence, there's always more than one stakeholder in a relationship. It's not, and you really need to make it work for both parties if you're going to have a business relationship going forward. But also when you're trying to do a deal with someone and you're trying to get a customer, for example, then you need to understand them and who makes decisions within those organizations. And so a lot of the people I've talked to over time would often discuss that. So when you're looking at doing contracts with government or with large companies, and we negotiate deals with companies overseas like, Apple and Amazon, and we've just done a deal with News Corp on something. You need to know who the stakeholders are and get as much business intelligence on their side as to how that's going to impact your negotiation. So it's not just about what you're trying to negotiate, it's about how are you going to get there? And the way you get there is through the people and making sure that you've got a couple of people on either side, helping guide the behaviour and discussions. Because otherwise, lawyers being lawyers, no one wants just lawyers in a room arguing things at the end of the day.
But at the end of the day, you're talking about, in terms of business intelligence, understanding both sides of the equation, so you know what the strengths and weaknesses of their position are, what they want, what they don't want, and where the points of real power in that negotiation sit, right? And
that's really what I've found, I think, is the sort of driving focus of how I look at everything is what's that pathway? And again, if you don't understand them, then it's very hard to work out what that pathway is, but you've got to go through that phase where you understand their business, work out what they want, and not just what they tell you, but what they really want, and then guide them. And that's no different to when I start, doing, being a lawyer, is that, like I was saying earlier, you're asked about things and you're giving advice, not just on what they want, but on what they need. Because sometimes you might be saying, I know you've asked me about this, but you also need, this is what you actually need. I know you're not going to like it. And
how do you have those conversations, Grant? Because that is critical, right? And is it just a matter of saying it, or is there some other way you go about it?
So I'm pretty blunt, but I think part of it's a personality. From that respect. But I think part of it's a personality thing. So it's easy for some people to get the message across than others. If you've got trust, you can do it. So it's a lot easier to have those conversations when you've had a longer relationship. I think it's more difficult when you're in the infancy of a relationship, which is where you've just got to come straight to the point with them and say, here's what you should or shouldn't do. And although you've tasked me to do this, I don't think that's a very good idea for you. I don't think this is what you should be doing. And I've had those conversations. I had one, for example, one of the startups I was working with wanted to list and met me through somebody else. And I said, and wanted us to do the listing for them. And I said to him, it'd be about the worst thing you could do. You're too small. You're going to constantly need capital, and you're not going to be anywhere near as flexible because you're going to be telling everyone everything. He said, but I need the capital now because I've got this potential to get this really large contract and I don't have a balance sheet. And unless I have a balance sheet, I can't get the contract. Cart before the horse stuff. And so I convinced him. I said, look, we'd make a lot more money telling you to do, going ahead and do your IPO and all the brokers and everyone wins, but it's just dumb. And so what we did instead was help him access capital in private markets. I think we'd probably in the first year made 25% of what we would have made if we were doing his work as a public company and listing them and so on. But then over the next few years, we sort of helped build that business up. I came in as the chairman for it, and then we eventually sold it into the US to a VC-backed company in the US, and at a much larger valuation than we would have ever got here. And now he's moved from here and runs that company in Chicago. And so it's funny how those things, if you actually look at it from the perspective of what they need, and they understand that you're actually doing it from that motive and saying this is what you need, and they might not like it because they've got other immediate requirements or because the ego gets in the way or otherwise. But once they understand that you're actually trying to be a benefit to them and trying to do the right thing and surround them with people or surround them with advice that actually makes sense, and that goes into that trust thing, then I think the good ones will always take that. And so it is easier if you're reasonably confident coming in because you can say, I've done this before and this is what you should do. But again, at a business level, I think that's so important to be honest about that. And sometimes those two things don't mix, and some people might say, well, you're not for us, and that's fine.
Is what it is.
it is what it is. But you want to have those synergies where both sides learn. Whether, I sit in as chairman for private tech companies now and public, but you want your founders to trust you. And so sometimes you're going to be on absolutely all for everything they say, and sometimes you're going to be saying that's a dumb idea. Why would you do that? And then be able to have the conversation. And I think that's probably the biggest skill over the last few years, is just refining that, I suppose, narrative and that conversation with different people. But I was lucky I learned it early, because being a litigator, you're always telling people something they don't like.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. That makes sense. What about the best decisions you've ever made in terms of growing the business? Is there anything that you look at when you look back over the last sort of 25 odd years and go, well, actually, this or this was a critical or the most important decision I made in hindsight?
I think best decisions early on was moving away from anything that was commoditized work.
Yep.
So we had some early clients where we were on panel, effectively doing fixed pricing for things, and you can do that for financial institutions, insurance companies, and so on. We did all that. Didn't love it. I didn't. And I don't think any of us really like doing it, but it doesn't appeal to how we do business and how we like. It's not really advising. It's really being a compliance transactional.
Yeah.
A people platform for compliance and transaction. And so this is before tech came around, but that's really, you could see it coming in the future. When I was a lawyer, when I first started, lawyers were the only ones who could do settlements for residents. And then settlement agents came in, cut the pricing out from under lawyers. And so lawyers all of a sudden, if they wanted to do settlements, they had to cut their rates to 30, 40% or less of what they used to charge. So you want to be in that space. Advisory work is a whole different ballgame, because it combines everything from obviously the intellectual side and working out what the rules are and explaining what the rules are to your client, but also managing all the different personalities on your side and on the other side, whether you're doing it as a negotiated fight in litigation, or whether you're doing a transaction, acquiring a business or selling a business. It's the same sort of thing. And again, in tech, that's really what you're doing all the time, is sort of making those assessments. And I think for me, that was the shift where we decided really to focus on stuff that I enjoy, and so which is why we started moving more and more into textile businesses and just businesses generally, where you focus on the people. And the best decisions you can make are looking after founders of businesses and then helping them build it, because they know they can rely on, they know they can trust you. And quite often they move elsewhere. And that's the other thing is you're helping out. If you're helping someone at a management level who's giving you work, they don't necessarily stay with that same employer. So quite often what happens, you get one client with them, and as they move across other clients, you get the next client, you keep them all. And so you'd follow them across, and that happens a lot. So I think that was the first big thing. And then, and obviously having a solid partnership, we've all been together for a very long time now. And that, I think, is really attributed to culture and being open about failures and successes. So if you're good at something or someone does something well, you tell everybody, you internally say what a good job they've done. If people, for want of a better word, fuck things up, you tell them, but you don't tell everybody, you tell them, get them to fix it. And so you be very, you have an open culture about what's good and what's not, rather than trying to shy away from the fact. I think quality people like being told what they do well and what they don't do well, because how they learn otherwise. And so if that sort of helps that growth. And I think those are the decisions where, if you're open about that, that's really helped my business grow. And then as we evolve, what are you evolving into? Because if you stay the same, you really get left behind, particularly if you're going to be a small boutique, a practice, rather than, which is what we are. And the great part of that is, I get to do deals all around the world and work with businesses all around the world and negotiate in different corners of the globe on things for all sorts of people. And I think if we hadn't been open to that and moving early, and then we wouldn't have been able to deal with how fast technology has changed everything. Because now that everything's moving a lot faster, you have to go that, you have to evolve and adapt pretty quickly. Whereas we're already sort of moving forward with our clients. And again, as I said, sort of staying away from that commoditized work and doing what we enjoyed doing and sticking to what we know. And if there's something we don't know, don't try and do it, and then go and refer it to somebody who does. And bring in other relationships and not necessarily expecting to get anything out of it. So you'd quite often, let's say tax. I mean, tax is, minefield. Bring people in who actually know what they're doing, especially if you're doing, these days, for example, cross-border tax transactions and tax structures are so critical. So you want to bring in the right people to do that from the outset to businesses. And it's not anything we want to do, get involved with. And you don't expect anything in return. So starting to building out trusted networks and building out networks of people you can rely on, I think is very important in a business, whether you're doing it in what we were doing legal, but every business I've seen, the more people you can rely on and stress test things and stress test people, because you want other business people you can ring up when you've met someone new going, do you know these, having those networks where you can check people's bona fides, particularly if you've never heard of them and you think something sounds too good to be true, or are they good to deal with? I've heard this and that. And I think, again, that sort of comes back to, those relationship skills. And that's really what's helped us grow all the time, because it then becomes sort of like a never ending referral network. And then what you then really focus on is you work with the people you like. And if you work with people you like, the reality is you tend to do a better job.
Yep.
I think it's that simple.
What's your favorite part of the job as a professional doing the role of an advising and as a business builder? What are your favorite parts? What do you like doing best?
I do like a good fight still every now and then.
Yeah, I know.
So I like the bigger dispute. Look, I get involved in a lot of mediations and larger disputes, but most of those these days, if you're having large early on disputes, they are done out of court. The negotiation side in terms of M&A activity, I really enjoy, and strategically looking at not just for my own business, but particularly for clients, how they build out footprints, so IP footprints, for example. So what's going to be value accretive to your business in terms of acquiring it, and how do you go about acquiring? What are we wanting to achieve when you do this transaction, or vice versa? If you're selling it, what are you selling? So the business I was telling you about before was the guy who wanted to IPO. It was a little business called Fleetsuit, and it was a telematics business. And so the thing about telematics, and once we'd sort of got some capital behind him and built it out, and he's a Polish guy based in Perth. Now he's based in Chicago. Jakub Felinski, who's a great entrepreneur, one of those rare guys who can code and be a good marketer and a good salesman, which is, I think, an unusual mix. Got Toyota, had all Toyota fleet vehicles in Australia on the platform and rolling that out. But at the end of the day, Australia's a small market. So, and as a platform, you want to have distribution. And so those are the things you enjoy, is going, how do we get, and this is from my point of view, I think that's the big thing, is how do you scale something and how do you really move that into other markets? And that's really what I probably enjoy the most. I'm finding that I'm having a lot more conversations with different time zones than I ever used to have. We're dealing with Asia, with Europe, with America every week, and it's fascinating just how easy it is. The transaction we did for Fleetsuit, we did in COVID over Zoom. The whole deal was done on Zoom, which is wild. And they actually wanted to meet us, and we said, well, we can't come to see you. And they were sort of, why not? We're going, because we won't be getting back into our own state. And then they said, well, we can come and see you. And we said, you can't come here. We won't let you in. And which was a very interesting conversation.
Funny times, eh?
Yeah. Americans are still looking at you, what? But again, that sort of stuff these days, you can now have, what's so fascinating to me, and this is a great thing, by the way, about there's pros and cons of the internet and social media and everything. But we now have access all the time for free to the best thinkers in the world.
Yeah.
And so there's, those different perspectives on things are now a lot more accessible because you don't have to go and meet people to get that perspective. Like, how I started off was getting it from people I was working with and meeting over time, or you'd read books and so on, but it really wasn't, there wasn't that same volume of stuff. And like what you're doing with this podcast is amazing because it's the same sort of thing. You're getting access to how people think about different things. And that's something which, it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have any of those things accessible to us. It really wasn't. I mean, I remember, when iPads came out, because I was in a massive negotiation with a bank, and I remember sitting on the other side of them and, their lawyers on this, really large deal, and they all brought out iPads, and I was thinking, I really want one of those. And because they'd just come out, and I still had their clunky laptop, and I was trying to find a place to plug it in and deal with it. And so, yeah, it's quite fascinating how fast things are evolving, but also how fast we can communicate and the people you can communicate with. And I think that's probably the opening those channels for people. And then for, as I said, for clients or founders is really, and then helping them negotiate and find their way through the traffic, particularly when you're dealing with, whether it's a big bank, a big multinational, there are behaviors in those organizations which I've come across, again and again, that you learn how to deal with. And that's just a skill set you have. And that's the fun part of being able to help people with that, because you want the client to be able to focus on what they're good at. And that's again, why they should be, surround yourself with the best people you can. And that's, I think, that sort of business mantra. And a lot of people have sort of repeated in different forms, but the more you hire smart people or bring smart people in, or bring in people who have skills that you don't, the better off you're going to be. Yeah. Because you can't be good at everything. And also you just don't have the bandwidth. I mean, you get the most benefit out of what you're best at.
Yeah. And also what you like as well. What you're talking about earlier is doing the things that you like. And that's where a lot of your business comes from now, is not, it's the stuff you want to do. And that's what drives the whole firm, is the sort of stuff that you want to do and work on. And it makes complete sense. Yeah. All right. A couple of final quick questions to finish off, Grant. I've got here, who's a business person or a few business people that inspire you, and why?
Bizarrely, because I'd only met him a few times. There was a West Australian gentleman over here called Stan Perrin. You probably remember him, given you came from these parts. And what I liked about Stan, and I spent a long time with him on a plane once. I never did business with him, just I bumped into him a few times. Every time we did, we just had these, amazing chats. And he was always, and he was quite old both times, he was getting quite old towards the end of it when I was having this last chat. He loved business and he loved the things you grow out of, but he was also very philanthropic and really wanted to give back. And he's got obviously a big philanthropic foundation. So I think people like that, to me, are important because, yes, they make money, but it's also not the only thing. And a good friend of mine recently said there are different currencies that people deal in. And so the currency is not always money. And I think that's part of what's important is actually working out what currency you're dealing, which sometimes helping people grow and do things, or, helping them deal with a bigger problem they can handle is that. And so you have these different currencies for behavior that drive you. And so I always like following those people who have those and looking at them. So I don't think there's him I would talk about because, he's gone now, but I think he set a great example. And I think there's a lot of people these days who don't do that, but could. And so I think that rather than the focus on money, and I find Elon fascinating because as a business leader, he's utterly focused and also quite amazing how much he manages to handle. Whether you like his politics or not, I think he's done amazing things because he has open sourced what he did. Mark Andreessen, I think, is really great as well. And there's a big thing on at the moment about AI and open source AI or not. And there's a lot of pushback in the US to bring it under the control of just the bigger companies and government, which I think is a terrible idea. So open source, I think, is those people who do that and give it to the world effectively. I think you're amazing because that's how it should be, and that's how we grow as people. And I think socially, you want business to have some sort of social compass and work out how it's contributing. It's going to change because we're not going to be so often companies are always valued on how they're growing. They're going to have to grow in different ways. I mean, the way things are moving now, if you have a look at, I look at my children who don't like fast fashion and the things about that with plastics and so on. So that's going to change that whole industry as people move away from them. People start buying secondhand more and recycling things, and it's going to change behaviors. And once behaviors change, then what are people going to be buying in the future? It's not just going to be consume and keep throwing things out that they can consume unless it's digital. And I think digital is there's still a long way to go in that market and where that goes. So it's those sort of people who are actually sort of leading intellectually, I suppose, from the front, saying this is where we should go. This is not all about money. And those people, as I said, like Elon Musk are really good at where they open source. Let's open up these ideas, because let's face it, people are going to be doing these things all around the world. We're lucky in Western countries that we have democratic environments where you can explore things. And I think those sort of leaders are the ones we need more of.
Yep. What about books? Do you, in terms of, has there been a business book specifically that you've read over the years that you sort of, I mean, I've got a few myself where they're just sort of like, their books are just in my top 5 that I just love, and I'll just read them every now and again, go back to them like my Bible on a certain topic, Have you got any books that you sort of just always stuck with you?
One early on, I don't read that many of them, but I read John Dewar's Measure What Matters. I don't know if you know that one.
Yeah. I was just looking at that on my bookshelf this morning.
Yeah, which is funny because I think what people sometimes do, and when you read books and they resonate with you, he had early on, he was one of those things, ideas are easy, execution is everything, and they articulate it in a way that it's just a lot simpler. You think, oh, that's kind of either what I do or what I say. It's just that they're better at saying it.
Sometimes you look at a book and go like, that particular book, I've given books to people before and said, look, this is the message I want you to take from what I'm trying to tell you is just read this book, because they say it better than what I do. It's why reinvent the wheel if someone's already articulated it so well,
Yeah. There's another good one. David Shine's one, The Dumbest Guy at the Table, about the first unicorn in Australia. And it's just fascinating.
I know the book you're talking about. I haven't bought it, but I do know when you talk about it, and looked really good. Yes.
Yeah. So I think one of the things he says, you'll always have customers, staff, business relationships. How you deal with all those things are the key and the driver. So, which really comes down to culture and team and relationships and the things we've been talking about. And looking at it from a startup point of view, it's a really good little book actually, just in terms of his experiences. And he was the first unicorn in Australia anyway. So, and then the other one I've read recently, which is not so much a business book but more a report on it, is Bad Blood. On Elizabeth Thoreau and some of the things.
The genes genetic company. Yep.
And blood, and how she basically got all these investors in on something that was just complete bullshit. And I thought that was, it's a fascinating book on why people will invest in something which just is not true. But
you would have loved that from all angles, the business and the legal side of things, right?
The legal. It was interesting, and I think what's interesting about that is it shows you how much narrative drives behavior as well, and how she sold the story for something that was just crap. And raise money. I think she even raised money off, Berkshire Hathaway. She had all the big investors in and built this company up, but it was all, smoke and mirrors. And it was fascinating. And there's been other examples of those types of things that have happened. So quite often I'm fascinated to read those types of books, because it still shows you how, greed drives behavior and perceptions of narratives drive behavior as well. And if you turn that into a good thing, what it does is it teaches, for founders anyway, it's a really good thing to teach about messaging and how you can actually, if you've got something that's actually real and actually good, how do you message that properly?
But that's a fine line, right? Because a lot of that sort of startup culture is around, you've got your MVP and you've got a product and you start it, and the funny stories of once they've become successful was, well, in the early days, it looked like it was automated, but behind the scenes, everyone was doing everything manually. It's like,
Yeah.
so it's a fine line between saying, that's a funny story,
That's
between
right.
being there's a bullshit product. So, like you can see where people are trying to sort of fake it till they make it on the product, but actually cross the line and become actually fraudulent, or, like you got to weigh that up. And I think there's some of that culture, especially with that early stage stuff, is when because that's a great way to do things, is to build it and do it manually behind the scenes while you're proving it. But where does it cross that line where you're actually selling bullshit, right? And that's
it is interesting because our community over here, our BC community over here, is a lot more small business minded in terms of, let's build this out, make a profit, then scale it up. And I actually, with Voodoo, we had a big function with some time back with Silicon Valley Bank before the mess happened with them, who were great, actually. They came across, and one of the things I remember them talking about, I think we had 30 or 40 startups there at Voodoo's offices, and they were saying, the thing about Americans versus Australians, they said, you guys, about when you're building tech companies and so on, you're about 90% business and 10% bullshit, and American companies are 90% bullshit and 10% business. And what's happened in the US, and this is before this sort of, it was as some of the valuations started coming off, and they're saying American businesses need to get, better at being more about the business and the money side of it. But you guys need to get better on the marketing and saying, we want to be a global business, we're doing this, we're running at it, and not worry too much about this side, and getting that balance better. And that's where, because their ecosystem is bigger than ours, they will float behind big ideas. So they're more, there's more of them able to inject more capital to help you grow a bigger idea. Whereas here, it's a hard start over here, because there is capital around, but it's limited in terms of the number of people who actually understand tech business, biotech businesses, innovation, robotics, whatever. Because I work across that entire space, and I think, and that's just a product of population. That's a reality. What's interesting now, and I mean, you'd know this from the work you do, is that family offices, I think, are leading the way actually in seeding some of these things now, because we've now got more family offices than we've ever had, because the overall wealth has grown quite a lot in Australia, and there are a lot more billionaires than there ever used to be, and seriously wealthy people who are prepared to spend on some of these things. And so that's starting to change the dynamic, and they can lead ahead of the market because it's their money and they can do with it what they want, and they can be patient about it, because they're making their money elsewhere, and it's not going to kill them if they blow up a couple of $1 million.
What you've also seen, probably a lot of tech, especially in tech founders build their businesses and exit them, and now they're going through the next iteration of them they're seeding. So you've got a whole different dynamic to what you had probably 10 and 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they can stretch, and also they've got the ability to stress test it. So, mining founders could stress test mining businesses, but would know nothing about tech. Now you've got these people who've either made a lot of money out of tech and still making money out of it because they've got cash rolling in on dividends or otherwise, or they've exited, made a pile, and started investing across the ecosystem. And what constantly surprised me, and I think which is a nice surprise actually, is that there's always people willing to help out. And there's so many people who can be tapped, and there's people who are in other industries who are actually quite easy to move into tech. I mean, the reality is about tech. It's just the industrial space. You still need a CFO, for example, in a tech business, and good CFOs are worth their weight in. And so you want to try and drag them across from other industries, and quite often you'll find that ones, they're interested in looking at those and helping out and driving some proper financial discipline around a business, because they're not always financially disciplined in how they do things, because startups being startups by their nature are. There are a whole bunch of different skill sets. Sales, there are people in sales in tech who just, if they're good at selling stuff, they can sell anything anywhere. It doesn't really matter. So I think that's changing in Australia, and what's really helped is sort of the more high profile companies like the Atlassians and the Canvas of this world. The fact that they've made it privately before they've got, and really grown up, and then, got onto the NASDAQ, and they're seeing those bigger markets, but people understand that there's real wealth generated from those businesses. And also that there's a lot of people, because tech businesses are still people businesses. You need a lot of people to run a tech business. It's not a team of 4.
And often the family office has got, depending on where they made their money, they'll often have an area or two that they really like and know really well.
Yeah. Yep. And they can be strategic. Yeah, strategic. And like, I've been quite lucky in some of my network for the startups we've helped, because there's money, which is you need all the time, but also there are strategic investors who can open doors or help you with distribution and sales. And so they're really valuable. And so if you can tap into the right side of a family office or so on that has that ability to help you on that side, that's, worth double the money that they're putting in. Because all of a sudden you've got and they're helping themselves too, because they're helping create, help accelerate the rate of the value of their investment.
So what's next for you and your business, right? In terms of, is it more going in international type work, or what's next?
Well, I'm sort of really focused at the moment on helping accelerate some of the companies that I chair, Voodoo in particular, where we're just opening into Europe and America at the moment. So APAC was a great start for us, and it's got really good revenue here. But the bigger market is where we're now sort of moving into and really doing deals with the bigger players like Amazon. And that's fun because, well, it's exciting because there's a huge potential for, what's a world-leading product in that particular company. But it's also dealing with the different regions. I mean, Europe's very different from America, and the different countries in Europe are also quite different, although they're all, we've got business in London and others. And then I chair a cancer company out of Melbourne. So it's bizarre. Like I said, I do work around Australia everywhere, which is a small molecule immunology company, and really world leading in its research. And so again, that's something that we're taking into the clinic. It's about to start in its phase 1 trials, and helping that sort of grow. And the capital that's required for those sort of companies is, if you're not on the public markets, you really are looking for money on that overseas as well. So those are fun because, on the one hand, I've got one which does a really good thing for humanity, I think, in the cancer company, and it's a great thing. And I'd really like to see where that gets to. But the reality is, most drug development companies, whether innovative or not, will ultimately end up getting bought out by big pharma. Because if they're any good, that's the pathway. And big pharma is not in Australia. I mean, we don't have any big pharmaceutical companies. So you sort of got to recognise that, but hope it gets to the shelves. And then obviously, interspersed in those is you have these arguments with people where you're getting involved in the larger negotiations on matters, and that's a bread and butter thing. It's good fun.
That won't ever change. There'll always be someone disputing something, right?
There'll always be someone disputing something, and I do a lot of that. But I think in terms of what I love and what I want to see happen, I'm really keen on having Australian IP stay in Australia and help develop it and fund it here, because that's really what we need to do I think about it from my kids' point of view. We want to keep it here, and coming from Western Australia, we want to get smarter. We don't just want to be the state that digs stuff out of the ground. We want to build our IP, and the more we hold it, IP here, the better off we'll be, because IP lasts forever, particularly if people start using it elsewhere around the world, rather than selling it off. And I think we've still got a long way to go on that. I think that because so much, when you need that bigger capital, everyone's always heading over to the States for it. We've certainly got some good startup funds here who, if they get it to a certain point, the bigger funds from overseas will come in, but the IP still stays in Australia. And I think that's really what I'd like to see happen. I think that's really where I want to go with everything.
Nice. Well, look forward to seeing where you go with everything, Grant, and as the company grows and the various tech, especially in WA, progresses. Really, really interesting space. Thanks very much for your time.
You're welcome.